So I'm Dr. Fabian Sorce, and I'm a teaching fellow here in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, which is where we're currently sat. And in this session, we're going to start with a Q&A discussion with Dr. Joanne Dunster, Head of Research Infrastructure from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is part of UKRI. So Joanna will give us a short presentation about the current funding opportunities for search work from AHRC and elsewhere at UKRI, and how UKRI manages applications which lie towards the edge of scope of any given research council, including their relative priority and success rates compared to applications that are squarely in scope. So this will include information on AHRC's priorities, so sort of where does the scientific work fall in the priority list, which parts of science and cultural heritage have highest priority, panel composition and funding types, how this is changing throughout budget, what to do about the fact that scientific projects may be relatively expensive compared to humanities-only based ones, and the different success rates. So, and finally, an overview of where AHRC sees its remit and spending on scientific work evolving in the next decade or so. So now I'm going to hand over to Joanna, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabian. I really said I'd cover all that in 10 minutes. Oh no, I better get cracking. Thank you all for coming back after lunch. So I wanted to open with this statement which is drawn from UKRI's 2022 to 2027 strategy, Transforming Tomorrow Together. We love alliterations. We've committed ourselves as an organisation, of which the Arts and Humanities Research Council is part, to incentivising and removing barriers to multi- and interdisciplinary working by identifying and removing barriers to this work in the design, assessment and delivery of our funding programmes, creating the right portfolio of fundings to support the best ideas. Right and best are not very heavily defined in this context. I think that's generally left to the discretion of the councils and our peer review colleges, but you can see the general intention to the best of our ability to fund multi- and interdisciplinary work, individually as councils and collectively as part of UKRI. So that's the intention at any rate. For heritage science and conservation research, it sits in the gap, or the kind of intersection between the remits of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, of which I'm part. We have within our remit cultural and museum studies and art history, including technical art history, and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, represented by the blue circle. These are not to scale. If they were to scale, the blue dot will be about 10 or 11 times the size of the yellow one, but that depresses me. They have in their remit chemistry, materials, and physics. Missing from this diagram is, of course, the Natural Environment Research Council, which ought to be present as an even larger, when you take into consideration the fact that they fund things like boats and submarines, green dot, which includes, for example, archaeological science and the historic environment. Heritage science and conservation research, as you see, sits somewhere in amongst those disciplines as an interdisciplinary region of research. But I understand it can sometimes feel a bit more like this, where the remits of the two funding councils do not encompass that discipline, and it can feel like it falls between the stalls. It's worth me mentioning here a word on the cross-council remit agreement, which has been in place for, it goes off into the mists of time, back to when I first joined the organisation many years ago. It governs how we manage the proposals that cross the remits of more than one council remit domain. On our website, we state that the cross-council remit agreement helps us to encourage research proposals at the interface between research disciplines, as you see in this diagram. That's what heritage science and conservation research is. Ensure there are no gaps, between the funding council's remit domains, and we effectively support interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research. There's also a peer review function, so if a proposal comes to AHRC, which is predominantly AHRC, but has some more EPSRC flavoured components to it, we can borrow from their peer review college to make sure we get the appropriate balance of expertise to comment on the scientific validity of what the researcher is proposing to do. The cross-council remit agreement, in theory, means that where there's a proposal that crosses more than one council's remit, we jointly fund it by agreement on the very sophisticated basis of, we think this is roughly 70% AHRC and 30% EPSRC, therefore, EPSRC, will you kindly meet 30% of the costs? And it will go back and forward with the EPSRC colleagues saying, no, we think it's more like 80-20, to be honest. And we'll come back, well, actually, we thought it was 60-40, but we knew you'd say that, so we'll meet you in the middle at 70-30. Thank you very much. So I'll come back to how the cross-council remit agreement works in practice, but that at least is the theory, and it is still in operation on eligible schemes. For AHRC, our responsive mode has recently changed. These are the 4 core funding schemes that we currently advertise on an ongoing basis. Curiosity is a new addition. This is for exploratory research, networking activity, and idea generation to enable future research. We think we can squeeze into there archival research and characterization, particularly of museum, gallery, and archive collections. And we think that would be a pretty cool use of curiosity money to kind of characterize an archive or a collection before embarking on a piece of on a research project. Catalyst is now the catch-all for all of our researcher development fellowship programs. It will fund a single researcher, that's why it's sort of fellowship-shaped, without previous experience of leading a significant research project. That's what we're now saying instead of early career researcher, which was always a little bit of a loaded term, to unlock potential, build leadership, all that stuff. We're still continuing to fund our sort of vanilla-flavoured research grants, although the maxima on those grants has been raised from £1 million at full economic cost to £1.5 million at full economic cost, which makes it a bit more accessible for large research projects. And those are designed to fund teams, crucially, rather than a lone researcher, as the Catalyst scheme would. Finally, follow-on funding for impact and engagement. This is a lovely scheme. We like it a lot. It's a bit more light touch in terms of its assessment than many other schemes. It is only open to researchers who've held funding through any one of UKRI's other schemes, and it's designed specifically to fund impact and engagement activities in AHRC's remit. So even if you've had a NERC or an EPSRC or an Innovate grant, you can apply through the AHRC follow-on funding route if your project is broadly in the arts and humanities research domain. Talk to my colleagues if you're interested. The future of that funding route is unclear. We're still trying to assess whether we should go down more of an impact accelerator account route or keep follow-on funding open in addition to that. But for now it's still open, so I encourage you to make use of it if you can. In terms of the cross-council remit agreement, then, the only scheme which amongst this batch which has a direct equivalent in the other councils, EPSRC and NERC among them, is research grants. I think for fellowships, depending on what the fellowship is aiming to do, there may be some equivalence with other councils. It's best to email us before you consider putting in an application to talk to us, and we'll see whether it be eligible for cross-council funding in principle. And we can draw on our colleagues from NERC and EPSRC as well in that to inform that discussion. There is also a new addition to the UKRI funding landscape, and that is a cross-council responsive mode scheme. This is currently in a pilot stage. There are 2 rounds of this pilot phase, round 1 of which launched in spring this year and closed, I was going to say fairly recently, but I just realised we're in September. It's not all that recent at all. That was an outline application stage. There'll be a further deadline for those proposals that have gone through. It's a reasonably large funding pot, 32.5 million. It's large for AHRC. It's maybe not large for some of the other councils, but that will fund grants of up to £1.2 million for up to 24 months. And that's, again, designed to fund teams of researchers. It is designed to support the kind of interdisciplinary ideas that are not routinely funded or fundable through UKRI responsive mode schemes. Notwithstanding the cross-council remit agreement, which is designed to make sure that anything interdisciplinary can be funded by the councils. I think this is just to encourage more interdisciplinary activity, since the former route is not terribly well known. We believe it has the potential to be transformative for participating disciplines, or lead to the creation of new disciplines. And we invite applicants to demonstrate to us why they believe that to be true for their disciplines. And that's an important criterion for assessment of those proposals. There will be a further round which launches next summer, and further details will be published through the UKRI Funding Finder website in due course. I wanted to dwell for just a moment on the closest analogue we've had so far to the cross-UKRI responsive mode scheme, which is the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowships, in many ways the prototype for the cross-UKRI responsive mode scheme, but in a kind of fellowship package, though PDRAs can be funded through it, so is it really a lone researcher model? I don't think so. I've highlighted 4 projects funded through the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowships. These are the 4 of the projects that are more or less in the Arts and Humanities Research Council's domain, in many cases shared with other research councils. And we do try not to be too territorial about these because they are supposed to be a cross-UKRI scheme, but we're terribly, terribly proud of these. And you can see from all of them that there's kind of a heritage-y, archaeological, science-y flavour to them. This discipline or disciplinary area has done very well overall out of the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowships because it's the kind of interdisciplinary work that sometimes struggles to find a home through standard AHRC and other councils' funding applications. So we're reading into that these are the kind of projects that might have a good chance at getting funded in the cross-UKRI responsive mode programme, if one can generalise. And we're very keen to support researchers interested in applying to this scheme to do so, banking on past success and seeing what we can learn from applicants to the Future Leaders Fellowship scheme. I've spoken with all 4 of these women, and they're incredibly generous with their time and expertise and their experience, their sort of general experience of applying for this funding scheme. And I'm sure if there's anything generalisable to the cross-UKRI responsive mode funding scheme, they'll be keen to talk you through it if you're interested. So get in touch with me, and I can put them you in touch with them. Finally, I wanted to mention, rather than a research funding programme per se, an infrastructure funding programme, since I am, after all, the head of research infrastructure. This is the Research Infrastructure for Conservation and Heritage Science, or RICHES programme, which is currently undergoing the final stages before its launch next summer. This programme is designed to ensure the heritage science community has the capability and capacity to meet user demand and continue to deliver world-class scientific excellence. It's designed to ensure heritage science equipment, expertise, resources, and research data are findable and accessible, and ultimately to catalyse the development of an informed, collaborative, and innovative UK heritage science community. It's £80 million over 5 years. It's going to be long-term, we hope, something that you can plan research programmes around, and will have a really transformative effect, as the infrastructure sobriquet implies. Funding calls for this opportunity are currently live. These are infrastructure funding calls as opposed to research funding calls, so they're funding equipment, facilities, and a small amount of researcher time to set up access to collections and facilities. If you're interested in these funding calls, I can speak a little bit more about those either over email or a Zoom call later on. I didn't want to spend too much time on this element of it, except to flag that when the infrastructure is up and running from next summer onwards, there will be an ongoing funding call for access to facilities, collections, and expertise. These will be relatively small grants, up to about £10,000 each, to cover costs like insurance and transport of objects to facilities, or indeed of mobile equipment to places where collections are stored, to cover for the institution providing the facilities, staff time, bench costs if applicable, and consumables associated with the research, generally in order to make existing heritage science equipment and facilities more accessible. And there will be a corresponding directory of heritage science equipment, facilities, and collections, which will help to signpost researchers who are interested in participating in this research and who have research questions based on their objects and collections, to help them to find the expertise and the equipment that they need. So, as I say, that will all be in place, all being well, from next summer onwards, and will be an opportunity that will be open to Any of you. PhDs, postdocs, those not employed by a university, those not employed by organisations normally eligible for UKRI funding, is designed with accessibility in mind. And applications will be received through a dedicated infrastructure headquarters based at Daresbury SciTech campus in Cheshire, which will also be the front door to the infrastructure. And if you fancy a visit at any time, they'll be delighted to receive you. This is the digital research service component of that infrastructure. As I say, that catalogue or directory of the UK heritage science ecosystem. And crucially for data, there will be an aggregating function to make existing digital collections and assets navigable and searchable. We don't have a URL for this yet, otherwise I'd give you the link. But there'll be more information coming up through the AHRC website over the course of the next 9 months or so. I'll stop there. That's a lot of information to have thrown at you in a short space of time, and I think we have about 15 minutes for questions before the next presentation.
Firstly, thank you very much to Joanna for your talk, which was very interesting and a lot of information for us to all digest. So do we have any questions for Joanna? We've got about 10, 15 minutes that we can discuss different ideas or anything that you'd like to know. We have one at the back. Thank you.
I was interested to hear that you said something about transport, because one of the main obstacles we're finding is to get the object from the museum to the neutron beam. We can't just get a curator to pop it in his suitcase and get on the train, which was the case a generation ago. We have to employ art handlers and who are very expensive. And the insurance is ridiculously expensive. And up to now, there doesn't seem to be enough fund to pay for this. But do I understand that we can apply to this for transport insurance costs?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Very helpful. Who do we write to?
You'll apply to the Arts and Humanities Research Council. There will be an infrastructure headquarters, a sort of dedicated team responsible for administering that funding pot and many other things besides. The process will be, we hope, as light touch as possible. There will be an application form which the person wishing to use the facilities will complete with a letter of support from the facilities, so from Antonella Scario at ISIS, or her equivalent at Diamond, or at the Central Laser Facility, or at the Natural Environment Isotope Facility, or any of these others, saying, yes, this looks like a good use of our equipment, I will be very happy to support this project. And then this will be peer-reviewed, and if successful, the funding will be dispersed as quickly as possible to allow the research to take place.
Thank you.
Yep. I'll just wait for get a microphone. Sorry.
Hello, thank you very much. I was just wondering, you said it was similar to the Hyperion funding. So we wouldn't have to handle a grant or anything. It's just for individual funding to use the equipment, facilities, and expertise at a different institution.
Are you talking about the research infrastructure for conservation?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was modelled on Imperial and its the European Research Infrastructure for Heritage Science programmes. It's designed to directly interface with those programmes. We're still investigating whether it will be possible through this route to fund international partnerships. We, of course, have a finite amount of funding available, but if we can accommodate it, we'd very much like this to be a kind of springboard for greater collaboration with Hyperion and IRIS colleagues in other countries. The users of this infrastructure needn't hold a grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, infrastructure or otherwise.
Because one of the stipulations for IPERIANHS was that it had to be in a different country. So this is stuff that you can actually do within the UK.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you.
It's a very general question, but can you talk about what criteria you might have to judge merit in applications?
Applications to which funding scheme? Any of them. We do our best to be transparent with these things, and so any funding opportunity that's listed on the UKRI website will have a list of the criteria against which the application will be assessed, and we are duty-bound to indicate if and to what extent the assessment criteria are weighted. So it's safe to assume, unless we indicate that that one assessment criterion will be weighted over others, that they'll all be taken into consideration equally. There's generally something about scholarly merit, which we test through, of course, peer assessment. There's generally something about value for money. There's generally something about a wider societal impact. Depending on the funding scheme, that may be a more or less important criterion. For fellowship schemes, there's generally something about the development opportunities for the fellow and their team, if it's a team endeavour. I think for the research infrastructure for conservation and heritage science, the emphasis is, as I say, on access and accessibility. So we'll be looking for applications from researchers or users who would not normally be able to access this infrastructure, who may not be able to draw on other existing sources of funding or local arrangements. So we've sort of scenario tested this with various imaginary users in mind, and one of those is a curator at a museum which does not have in-house laboratory capacity, but has a conservation or a technical question about an object or collection within their institution, where there isn't an established pathway for them to access either a major national scientific facility or a laboratory at a university or another of the major national museums. This fund would enable them to do so. So we'd be looking for evidence of need or unmet demand. That's maybe a bit too specific. I hope that was helpful.
On your first slide, you had your two big circles, and then you split them up and said you had the bluey colour, if I remember correctly, greeny blue. The sort of funding, which was that, is maybe 10 times the amount from the sort of more humanities-based side. Would you say there's a need and want from the funding body to sort of collaborate more and cross over between these two areas and sort of fill that middle part? Would that give a lot of weight to an application if it sort of tried to cross those bridges and really show that collaboration between those two sides?
Absolutely. There's real emphasis, as I indicated from the first slide, within UKRI on interdisciplinary initiatives and cross-council working. Without wishing to give too much of an insight into how the sausage is made, I suspect there's a lot of willingness within all councils to work collaboratively and to fund interdisciplinary research. However, all councils are fairly cagey about their budgets and directly answerable to the researchers within their remit. So the problem that we've traditionally either perceived or in some cases encountered, although I've only heard about this apocryphally, is speaking with arts and humanities researchers from what one might call our core disciplines. So your sort of classic historians and philosophers and music scholars, and they might sort of tap one on the shoulder and say, I can quite understand why you want to fund this heritage science stuff, but why is this science, as they perceive it, taking precedence over the budget for our disciplines where there aren't any other sources of funding? Why isn't this EPSRC's job? And I imagine, although I don't know for certain, EPSRC have the same thing from their communities, who will say, this heritage science stuff is all very well, but shouldn't AHRC be doing it? Is this really a burning question for physics or material science? And so I think this is slightly how it's come to fall between the stalls. And I don't think it's because of a lack of willingness, just a lot of competition for a very limited store of funding and a lot of very worthy things that we could spend it on.
Great.
You highlight the lone researcher catalyst awards. How are they different from sort of what I might know as the standard EPSRC fellowship?
I must be honest with you, I don't know much about the standard EPSRC fellowships.
Can you then explain a little bit more about the Catalyst Awards?
This is a rebranding and a re-emphasis of what used to be our I can't remember what they were called, researcher development fellowships, previously leadership fellows back in the day. As I say, the emphasis is on researcher development and enabling researchers who haven't previously held a large research council or other funder award to develop their ability to lead a major research project and to undertake that and to get that expertise. I think there's a sense that it's a sort of a bridging step to applying for a larger research grant, although it will, of course, entail undertaking a research project. So it's not a scoping activity, but it can be a sort of enabling activity from the perspective of that individual researcher.
I have one, and that's to ask about panel composition, which goes to the comments you were just making about one group saying, I think this belongs to the other group. I was wondering whether you've got any plans to adjust panel composition to allow for people who, it's not so much for me the issue that one group doesn't see the value in the other, it's that if you don't have a lived experience of doing multidisciplinary work, you won't necessarily understand the challenges, and it would be good if that could be assessed as well.
Absolutely, and this is a subject on which I could talk for hours. Panel assessment and peer review. You stay long enough at the research councils and you become a real nerd about these things, and I'm guilty of that, as many of my colleagues are. So for the AHRC responsive mode panels, and this will also be true of the UKRI responsive mode, those panels are multidisciplinary. So assessing your heritage science proposal, assessing it, of course, there will be peer reviewers from your own research domain, and you'll have the right to reply to those peer reviews, and those reviews and your response to them, along with the proposal, will all go to the panel as evidence for the fundability or otherwise, and the merits or the weaknesses of your proposal. But after that, certainly for the AHRC responsive mode schemes and the cross UKRI responsive mode schemes, final verdict on that proposal may be by, in the case of AHRC responsive mode, music scholars, performing arts scholars, historians, architects, from across the AHRC's subject area remit. And this is deliberate, partly because we can't tailor our assessment panels our moderation panels to the applications that are received, and partly in order to enable a sort of broad view, which will allow us to compare apples with oranges, with watermelons, with grapes. This is even more so the case for the UKRI responsive mode panels. I don't know yet what those panels are likely to look like. There will, of course, be a peer review stage, so any application going to that scheme will be assessed by people from the same subject area or areas as the researcher submitting the proposal. But I expect the panels will be very broad in composition and generally along thematic rather than disciplinary lines. So what we've done with the Future Leaders Fellowships, for example, is to have thematic panels rather than those corresponding to Research Council's remit. So we might have a panel themed around health and well-being, for example, that includes researchers from the Medical Research Council's remit, AHRC's remit, ESRC's remit, looking at proposals from across the remit areas of all of those councils. And this really sort of drives home the interdisciplinarity of it, so that they can get a really rounded take on the merits of that proposal, and ideally avoid researchers getting on their hobby horses and saying, I don't like this proposal because I wouldn't do my research that way. I've forgotten what the question was.
But it was a very interesting insight behind the scenes. Anyway, thank you.
We have time for one more question, if there are any in the audience.
If there's no one else, I'll ask again. Okay, so we have your diagram on the screen. We are, if you like, in the green area. We can't apply to the green area. How do we decide do we apply to AHRC or EPSRC?
From our perspective, it depends on sort of which questions are leading the application. So if it's applying scientific methods to answer an essentially arts and humanities question, how is this made, when was it made, how can we best conserve it, then it's AHRC. If it's developing a new methodology or technique that uses material science techniques, then it will be, even if it's using cultural heritage materials, it would be more in EPSRC's remit. If it's both of those things, I would, or if you're not certain, I would suggest there's a remit contact form on the UKRI website. You tick boxes to indicate which research council's remit you think the proposal falls into, which could be AHRC, EPSRC, NERC, any other. And that query will be directed to my colleagues in those research councils who will review it. And based on their experience of seeing similar proposals in the past or in other kind of adjacent disciplinary areas, we'll come up with their own assessment of, we think this is around about 40% AHRC, and then our EPSRC colleagues say, well, we think this is about 10% EPSRC, and you end up with a sort of camel. And then there's a meeting at which cross-council remit colleagues come together and discuss these things and come to some sort of consensus. And those can be really fascinating discussions. I'm very sorry we don't broadcast them. It's trying to understand what about it is that makes a proposal AHRC in character or EPSRC in character. We do make an attempt to define areas where they're on the border of different councils' remits. There's such a page on the AHRC website, for example, and I think a whole section in our funding guide dedicated to if your proposal is on the boundary between AHRC and ESRC remit or AHRC and EPSRC remit, here are some things that you might consider. But it can be quite ineffable, and we do our best to fund things. If we think there's a relatively even split, one council will generally do the honourable thing and step up and say, we'll take the lead on this.
So the answer is sort of, it doesn't really matter. We sort of put it in to what we think is the relevant council. If UKRI decided it isn't, it will simply be sort of sorted out internally, as it were.
Yeah, that's correct. Although, of course, different councils have different funding schemes. And as I said, the cross-council remit agreement only works for some funding schemes. So even if we agree that a proposal that's been put, or that's sort of directed at an EPSRC funding scheme is more AHRC in character, unless it falls under the cross-council remit agreement, we generally won't be able to fund it, although we will work with you to find an equivalent scheme or as close to as we can with an AHRC's remit.
Okay, great. Well, can we thank our speaker, Joanna, again?